Well, welcome to tonight's Trinity U lecture. I'm so glad you've made it out tonight. Let me begin with a word of prayer. Almighty God, fountain of all wisdom, enlighten by your Holy Spirit those who speak and those who listen, that, rejoicing in the knowledge of your truth, we may worship you and serve you from generation to generation. We pray this through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. Well, I want to begin tonight with a simple question. Oh, look at that. Who shot JFK? Do you buy the official theory that it was a lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald? Or do you think maybe it was agents from Cuba acting on orders from Fidel Castro? Maybe it was some mafia hitman sent by a boss in Chicago that was angry and out for revenge. Or perhaps it was some CIA assassins following a plot hatched by Lyndon Baines Johnson. Well, while we're at it, let me ask you another question. Did Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin actually land on the moon? Or was it all faked in a Hollywood soundstage just down the road here in LA? And then aliens, right? Did aliens crash in Roswell, New Mexico in 1947, and the government covered it all up at Area 51? Now, you laugh, but conspiracies like these have crept out of some of their smaller, skeptical subcultures into the center stage of American life today. And some conspiracy theories are so outlandish that they really strain credulity. There is the so-called phantom time hypothesis, which says that the early Middle Ages are a complete fake, Charlemagne never existed, and our calendars are all wrong. There's also the birds aren't real conspiracy. Have you guys heard of this? Birds are all little tiny CIA drones, and they're spying on you every day. There's the Paul is dead theory, right? The classic from the 60s. It says that Paul McCartney died in 1966 and the Beatles replaced him with a lookalike, right? Yeah, it might be true. And then there's another classic, the Reptilian Conspiracy, which states that most world leaders are actually shape-shifting lizard people. When you look at some world leaders, you're like, maybe that one's actually kind of plausible. But again, it's somewhat of a laughing matter until you realize a public policy poll in 2013 found that 4% of American voters actually believe that conspiracy theory is true. So, while these conspiracy theories might sound wacky, others are much more serious. You don't need me to remind you of the many popular conspiracy theories today about COVID, about school shootings, climate change, elections, and vaccines. And then there's the cluster of QAnon conspiracy theories, which mostly centers around the idea that a group of Satan-worshiping elites are running a child sex ring and are trying to control our politics and media. Now, I'm not going to prove or disprove any of these theories tonight, which might come as a disappointment to some of you, but as a relief to others. And for reasons that I'll go into later, in most cases, it's actually impossible to logically prove or disprove conspiracy theories. What I do want to do is I want to point out that sometimes conspiracy theories are right. And there are a number of examples of this being the case, but I want to talk about just three. In 1975, the US government admitted that the CIA had run a program during the 50s and 60s called MK Ultra. And in the program, the CIA secretly administered drugs to unknowing American citizens in an attempt to develop, wait for it, mind control. Yep, government wanted to have mind control and did experiments on American citizens to develop that. Secondly, in 2012, journalists confirmed the long-rumored but seemingly unbelievable theory that Jimmy Savile, Britain's most beloved children's television host, had been a sexual predator and pedophile for many years. And the most famous confirmed conspiracy theory is the Watergate Scandal, from the early 1970s, where President Nixon and his allies abused presidential powers to cover up his involvement in a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters. Those are three famous confirmed conspiracy theories, and I really can't resist adding a fourth, which is in 2009, players from a certain baseball team from Houston admitted to stealing pitching signs, often banging on trash cans to alert their batters of upcoming pitches, and while simultaneously denying allegations of such sign stealing, those Astros used their shameless system to win a now tainted World Series in 2017, and I just can't remember which team they're playing against, and cheated out of that World Series. So, while most conspiracy theories are almost certainly false, some are true. How do we know which ones to believe? And that question is pressing because being wrong about conspiracy theories can have deadly consequences. During the Black Death pandemic of the Middle Ages, Europeans and many citizens believed false theories that Jews in their midst were the cause of the terrible, deadly disease. As a result, a series of massacres broke out against Jewish communities, including one in Strasbourg in 1349, where 2,000 Jews were burnt alive. The Holocaust itself was a result of the stabbed in the back conspiracy theory, which claimed that the only reason Germany lost in World War I was that the Germans were stabbed in the back by Jews and other undesirable elements in Germany. More recently, conspiracy theories inspired Timothy McVeigh to bomb a federal building in Oklahoma City in 1995, killing 168 people and wounding 680 others. Conspiracy theories also inspired Anders Breivik to kill 77 people in Oslo, Norway in 2012, and Brenton Tarrenton to gun down 51 people in Christchurch, New Zealand, just 2 years ago in 2019. Back in 2002, conspiracy theories and beliefs about them, about genetically modified foods, led the government in Zambia to reject food aid during a terrible famine at a time when 3 million people in that country were suffering from extreme hunger. And from 2000 to 2005, the government of South Africa, motivated by conspiracy theories, denied the existence of HIV/AIDS, causing an estimated 330,000 deaths from the AIDS virus. The consequences of believing in false conspiracy theories will hopefully not be a matter of life or death for our friends, our families, or ourselves. But false conspiracy theories do bind any believer into constricting circles of unreality, often producing a way of approaching the world, our country, and our neighbors that is filled with skepticism and fear. 2 Timothy 1, verse 7 says, "God has not given us a spirit of fear, but one of power, love, and sound judgment." So with that in mind, I'd like to ask the central question for this evening, which is how can we tell conspiracy fact from conspiracy fiction? And more broadly, the big question that we're asking is really one of how we can judge the truth on uncertain, controversial matters. Well, these are questions that classical Christian education can help us answer. As I'm sure you know, classical Christian education is centered on the three arts of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And in grammar, we teach our students here how to learn what is true. In logic, we help them discern truth from falsehood. And then in rhetoric, we teach our students how to powerfully proclaim what is true to others. And we do this not just with the easy questions, but with the hardest questions that humans have ever tried to answer. As a result, we graduate students who know what is true, but also have the intellectual humility to know that they don't know everything that is true, and are finally equipped with tools to seek the truth. It's my privilege to aid in that process here at Trinity as a history teacher and a rhetoric teacher. In my history classes, I teach students how to discern the truth about controversial historical events, where the facts are hard to come by, and none of the historical actors are telling the same story. And in my rhetoric classes, I teach students how to spot bad arguments and avoid being manipulated by seductive, destructive ideas and create instead their own powerful defenses of the truth. So my goal is to take some of the lessons that we teach about seeking and knowing the truth here at Trinity and apply them to the conspiracy theories that are increasingly around us. And before I dive into this project, I want to make one note. I want to be really clear that I'm not using the term conspiracy theory tonight as a pejorative or negative term, but instead as a technical description of a certain type of belief about the existence of conspiracies. And to support that, I have included in tonight's talk one or more conspiracy theories that I myself believe may be true. All right? So, what are conspiracy theories? Where did they come from? And how have they become so powerful today? So, what are conspiracy theories? Let's get some definitions on the board. The first is the idea of a conspiracy. What is a conspiracy? A conspiracy is a secret plot, usually planned by a powerful group of people who have some kind of sinister purpose. And there have been many true conspiracies throughout history. Let me just give you a few. Back in 44 BC, Julius Caesar was stabbed to death by a conspiracy of Roman senators on the Ides of March. In 1605, a group of English Catholics, led by Guy Fawkes, attempted to assassinate the Protestant King James I by blowing up the Parliament building. The conspiracy was discovered shortly before they could blow up the explosives, and the conspirators were captured and executed. In 1914, a Serbian secret separatist society called the Black Hand successfully plotted the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the spark that ended up lighting the fuse for World War I. And again, in 1972, the Watergate Scandal began with a conspiracy of a handful of White House operatives to break into the DNC headquarters. Now, notice that in each of these cases, as in most actual conspiracies, there's a small group acting over a short time frame before they're either discovered or they achieve their nefarious goal. Now, a conspiracy theory, as opposed to just a conspiracy, is a hypothesized belief about the existence of a conspiracy. Conspiracy theories often have a certain shared set of characteristics. They typically oppose the standard interpretation about that potential conspiracy, and they often reject the interpretations offered by traditional experts and authorities like scientists and historians. Conspiracy theorists often believe that they have unique access to the truths which they might be persecuted by the broader society for holding, but by knowing that, it separates them from the masses that believe the official account. Now, what kind of person believes in conspiracy theories? Well, surveys by political scientists and psychologists repeatedly find that believers cut across all gender, race, income, political affiliation, educational levels, and occupational statuses. And then finally, conspiracy theories are generally unproven and perhaps unprovable. Now, while there are many varieties of conspiracy theories, there are 5 broad categories of conspiracy theories that I think are helpful to note. And these come from Jesse Walker's The United States of Paranoia, a conspiracy theory from 2013, a good book that you might check out on this topic. And he identifies these 5 general types of conspiracies. First, there's the enemy outside. And this is where there are external figures that are suspected of scheming against one's own community. There's also the enemy within, which finds conspirators lurking within the community or within one's own nation, appearing just like ordinary citizens. There's the enemy below theories that fear that the lower classes are plotting to overturn the social order, and then there's the enemy above theories, which accuse the rich and the powerful of twisting events for their own benefit. And then finally, there's the rarest type, which is the benevolent conspiracy, which claims that there are positive powers operating covertly and working to improve the world and help people. Where do conspiracy theories come from? Well, they're by no means a recent phenomenon in American life, at least. One of the oldest conspiracy theories emerged during John Adams' presidency back in 1797. After witnessing the chaos and horrors of the French Revolution, a Scottish scientist named John Robison wrote a book alleging an international plot to root out all religious establishment and overturn all the existing governments of Europe by followers of a group called Illuminism. Now, the Illuminism movement was a pretty standard group of Enlightenment utopian idealists who wanted to bring the human race under the rules of reason. Again, pretty standard Enlightenment ideas. But Robison and his many nervous American adherents accused this group of being godless and wicked, bent on corrupting women and destroying property rights. Robison also accused the group of being the ones who secretly orchestrated the disorder and bloodshed of the French Revolution. And he made their name synonymous with a host of different conspiracies for future generations, calling them the Illuminati. In the 1830s and 1840s, as hundreds of thousands of Catholic Irish and Germans immigrated to America, various anti-Catholic conspiracy theories swirled about, leading to many violent attacks on Catholic churches and monasteries, including the terrible Philadelphia Bible riot of 1844, which left over 20 people dead and hundreds injured. Jumping forward to the 20th century, during the Great Depression, the Merchants of Death conspiracy theory alleged that the U.S. had been forced into World War I by greedy munitions manufacturers and bankers. And this theory helped keep the U.S. out of World War II, allowing Hitler to rampage across Europe, mostly unchecked until 1941. Then, during the height of the Cold War, in the 1950s, Senator Joseph McCarthy provoked the Red Scare by alleging the existence of a secret list of names of communists who had infiltrated the very heart of American government. And it was actually true that communist spies did operate in the US during the Cold War, but McCarthy's list was a fiction. It was made up, and the ensuing hysteria that his lies and congressional inquiries provoked created a climate of paranoia that unjustly ruined lives and careers of countless Americans who are innocent. And that takes us up to the Jfk assassination in 1963, which shocked the nation and spawned endless conspiracy theories. And then coming more recently to the national trauma, the 9/11 attacks, which created a new level of willingness to consider conspiracy theories, including believing that the attacks themselves had been an inside job. So while conspiracy theories have been with us since the beginning of America, over the last few years, conspiracy theories have surged into the mainstream of American culture. What explains this recent rise? And how have they become so powerful? Well, there are a number of reasons. I'm going to highlight 5, which I think are most important. The first is that conspiracy theories are always seen to rise during times of crisis and social upheaval. Theories are especially popular among groups who believe they're losing out or are being marginalized as a result of that upheaval. And since 9/11, we've had a series of crises and major social changes every few years in America. The second reason why I believe conspiracy theories are on the rise in the US is that the crises of the 1960s and the 70s involving Vietnam, racial unrest, and Watergate led to a breakdown of trust in governmental authority and social consensus, a breakdown that many historians have termed the age of fracture. As part of the fracture, we've seen a collapse in trust in traditional sources of knowledge and authority in America, like governmental officials, news media sources, and university-based experts. In the wake of that collapse and fracture, conspiracy theories of many types have flourished. Third, we've also seen a significant rise in social and political polarization and suspicion. And in this polarized climate, both conservative and liberal politicians and pundits have promoted and legitimized certain conspiracy theories to attack their opponents and score partisan points. For example, since the 1992 presidential election, the losing party has embraced a conspiracy theory targeting the winning president. There's the Clinton assassination theory. There's next the blood for oil theory of Bush's Iraq invasion. There's the Obama birther theory. And then there's the Trump and Russia theories. And then fourth, the American educational system has mostly stopped teaching the intellectual skills needed to think clearly and resist the allure of false conspiracy theories. Unlike classical Christian schools, American public schools no longer teach logic. They don't teach their students how to think deeply about what is and isn't scientific knowledge. They don't teach objective truths about morality or even that objective truth exists at all. And as a result, we're very quickly becoming a post-truth society where people make decisions on what they want to believe, mostly based on their feelings. Finally, all of these trends, the sense of crisis, the fracture of trust, the polarization, the loss of truth, have all been powerfully intensified by social media networks. These networks have also connected conspiracy theorists together in a new way. And to keep users on their sites for longer, social media algorithms actively push the curious to consume increasingly extreme conspiratorial content. So, with more and more conspiracy theories surging around us, how do we know which ones to trust and which ones to reject? I would like to offer tonight 5 principles for gauging the truth or falsity of conspiracy theories. Now, what I want to make clear, again, is that none of these principles by themselves can prove or disprove a conspiracy theory, but together they can help you know more about when you should be inclined to trust a theory and when you should be inclined to doubt. All right, so let's look at the first principle. The first principle is you should consider the source, but don't discount the source. In my US history classes, I teach students how to work through tricky historical controversies like what was the real cause of the Civil War, or was the US's entry into World War I actually justified? And in these controversies, there are many contradicting pieces of information. So how can we tell what actually happened? To start building some of these intellectual tools that students will need, early on in the year, we do something called the Lunchtime Fight thought experiment. So let's try it out tonight, all right? Imagine that you are Mrs. Macedo, and you have heard a rumor that there was a fight at lunchtime, all right? What do? How do you get to the bottom of what actually happened? Any thoughts? Yes? Ask around. Who do you want to ask? Witnesses. What kinds of witnesses do you want to ask?
Like anyone who was there.
Anyone who is there, right? And in particular, if there actually was a fight, you'd want to ask the people who were in the fight, right? And then you probably are going to ask maybe their friends who probably were close by when the fight began, when the fight ended, right? You might ask other students that were witnessing it. Maybe there were some teachers around, all right? Now, which of these people is going to give you the perfect explanation from start to finish of who started the fight, why they started the fight, what actually happened? No one. No one was going to be able to give you that answer, right? Obviously, the best witnesses of why the fight happened and what actually went down from start to finish would be the fighters themselves. But they are going to be deeply biased in the way that they tell you their story, right? So maybe you think about the friends, right? They're a little bit outside the circle, but maybe the friends weren't there when it started. They don't know all the details. They didn't know like the secret little jabs and like the biting that happened in the tussle, right? So maybe they don't know everything. Maybe you're hoping that there was just some sort of external observer, right, that just happened to see everything play by play, right? And even then, they probably don't have all the angles, right? So what do? You don't have a perfect observer. Most everybody is biased. Do you throw out all the biased evidence? You can't, because then you're not going to know hardly anything, right? And you can't just wait for the perfect observer. So in history, what we learn is that A, almost everybody is biased, and B, we don't discount the sources because they're biased, but we consider the sources for their bias, right? We think about how their bias might be impacting the story that they're telling. And that's a practice that we have to do over and over on any sort of historical issue. We need to consider the bias. We can't throw it out, because if we threw out all the biased evidence in history, we couldn't know anything that happened. All right. With that in mind, when we're talking about conspiracy theories and what is actually happening, we need to be very careful in considering the source. Who is talking to us? What might their agenda be? But again, on the flip side, we don't want to just discount them because they might have an agenda, because basically everybody has an agenda. And if we do discount the source simply because of who is talking, we're guilty of committing a logical fallacy, one of these fallacies that we teach in our logic classes. It's called the genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy is where you base the truth claim of an argument on the origin of its claims and premises. Let me give you an example of the genetic fallacy. Someone might say that smoking bans are wrong because the Nazis were the first to introduce smoking bans. Well, that is true, right? That is a historical fact. They're the first country to institute smoking bans. However, the fact that they are the origin of that idea doesn't say anything about whether smoking bans are good or not. We have to look at that claim on its own, and we need to discount the potential origin for that claim. Let's look at this again, an example from a recent conspiracy theory involving a potentially nefarious international organization that targets children. I'm talking about Chuck E. Cheese. Have you guys heard of this theory? In 2019, YouTuber Shane Dawson started promoting a conspiracy theory that Chuck E. Cheese is taking leftover pizza slices that were uneaten and putting them together into new pies and serving them to unsuspecting customers. All right? Now, when this theory got promoted, many Chuck E. Cheese employees went on social media and disputed the claim, saying, no, if there's any leftover pieces, we either eat them or we throw them out. So, they're biased, right? They clearly want to keep their jobs. They want to keep the company they're working for in business, so we throw out their evidence, right? No, we shouldn't do that, right? Nor should we just simply trust their evidence on face value. We need to do a little bit more digging. We need to think clearly, does this make sense? And look for other evidence as well. All right? In conspiracy theories, we need to evaluate the truth of the evidence separately from the source of the evidence. And this is something I need to make clear. Just because we like someone and agree with their perspective doesn't automatically make what they say true. Conversely, just because we dislike someone and disagree with their perspective doesn't automatically make what they are saying false. So that's the first principle. Consider the source, don't discount the source. The second principle, it's the time and numbers test. The time and numbers test. As one writer puts it, history shows repeatedly that real conspiracies, even very simple ones, are difficult to conceal and routinely experience unexpected problems. In contrast, conspiracy theories suggest conspiracies that are unrealistically successful and groups of conspirators who can act with near perfect competence and secrecy. For example, for the moon landing hoax, if it happened, to stay a secret, it would require about 411,000 people the number of employees at NASA at the time in the 1960s, all to stay quiet. In fact, an Oxford University physicist named David Robert Grimes a few years ago developed a formula for calculating the potential lifespan of big conspiracies. And Grimes estimates that if over 400,000 people were in on the moon landing hoax, the idea would have leaked out, the conspiracy would have broken in under 4 years. Similarly, there is a conspiracy theory that big pharmaceutical companies have a secret cancer cure, but they're keeping it a secret in order to sell more other cancer chemotherapies, right? Have you heard about this, the big pharma conspiracy theory? Grimes estimates that for that one to stay secret, it would require 700,000 people to know about the cure and not talk about it, a feat that he estimates would become impossible in under about 3 years. And to give a more, an actual conspiracy that broke down, Chuck Colson was a White House special counsel for President Nixon, and he was actually jailed for his part in the Watergate conspiracy. Colson later said of this conspiracy that actually happened, here were 10 of the most powerful men in the United States. With all that power, we couldn't contain a lie for 2 weeks. So for any conspiracy, consider the numbers of people who would have to be part of the secret and the amount of time that has passed without any proof of the plot leaking out. The larger the number, the longer the time, the less likely the conspiracy is real. Third, the falsifiability test. It may seem like the best theory has no holes, but actually, if a theory is unable to be disproved at all, that's a sign of intellectual weakness, not strength. And this is from the principle of falsifiability that comes to us from philosophy. And it states that a healthy hypothesis should have a condition in which the theory can be disproved. Let me say that again. A healthy hypothesis should have a potential condition in which the theory can be disproved. So the classic example of this is the theory that all swans are white, right? You've probably seen a few swans in your day. They have been white, probably, right? And so you might make this broader generalization to say, all swans are white. Is that a falsifiable hypothesis? Yes. What would it take to falsify it? A black swan, right? Now, how about this theory? It's possible that you are actually someone who was created last night in a vat, and you're created as a person that looks like you're however age you are, and then you're implanted with someone else's memories, all right? Now, is that theory falsifiable? Probably not, right? How would you know that that's not true if all these memories and all these ideas that are in your head have been implanted into you by some weird scientist or alien? So, if a theory is unfalsifiable, it's not a good sign, right? It doesn't mean that it's necessarily false. And to be clear, falsifiability doesn't prove that the theory is true. That's not a guarantee of its truth. Also, an important qualification, the principle of falsifiability doesn't mean you have to actually disprove your theory. That's not what that's talking about. It's just saying you need to have a possibility that your theory could be disproved. And then finally, to be clear, some unfalsifiable beliefs may be true. But if a theory is unfalsifiable, that's a pretty big red flag that you should be careful. Let me give you an example. At the start of Obama's presidency, many accused him of secretly being born outside the United States, maybe in Kenya. As support, conspiracy theorists pointed out that Obama had never released a birth certificate. So in 2012, Obama finally released his birth certificate. What was the response from the theorists? It was a forgery, right? Now, that could be the case. However, that move is a push towards unfalsifiability, right? The question becomes, what evidence would you accept that Obama was born in the United States? Would you accept it if his mother came forward and said, of course, he was born in this hotel in Hawaii, right? You'd say, no, 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 right? They've gotten to her already, right? They're forcing her to say these things, right? At that point, it's a big red flag. Be careful, right? You might be going into this path where nothing can ever be disproven. Many conspiracy theories are deeply unfalsifiable, like that reptilian conspiracy theory. And when it's pointed out that there's no evidence for those existing reptilian shape-shifting lizards, or pointed out in any type of conspiracy theory that there's no clear evidence for that belief, sometimes believers will say, well, that's just what we would expect. They've destroyed the evidence. There's this movie from 1997 with Mel Gibson in it called Conspiracy Theory. Mel Gibson and Julia Roberts. And Mel Gibson's character at one point, he's a true believer in that movie, and he says, a good conspiracy theory is unprovable. I mean, if you can prove it, it means they screwed up somewhere along the line. Well, C.S. Lewis dealt with this kind of conspiracy theory in the realm of literary analysis. And here's what he wrote about this type of theory. The very lack of evidence is thus treated as evidence. The absence of smoke proves that the fire is very carefully hidden. Yes, if the fire exists at all. But we must first prove its existence. Otherwise, we are arguing with a man who should say, if there were an invisible cat in that chair, the chair would look empty. But the chair does look empty, therefore, there is an invisible cat in it. Right? Look, you guys see the invisible cat up there? Right? An belief in invisible cats cannot be logically disproved, although it does tell us a good deal about those who hold it. This shows us another side of conspiracy theories, that they are often tightly logically consistent, but they will not consider evidence from the other side, nor even a scenario in which the theory could be disproven. And this way lies a particular form of intellectual madness, one that G.K. Chesterton once wrote about when he said, the madman is not the man who has lost his reason. The madman is the man who has lost everything except his reason. A good hypothesis needs to be falsifiable and needs solid evidence to support it. But what counts as solid evidence? That takes us to our next principle, the fourth, which is called the star test. In my rhetoric classes, we have a very basic idea. Arguments need evidence. Just because a theory sounds possible doesn't mean that we should believe it. For example, back to Chuck E. Cheese. Reusing old pizza sounds like something Chuck E. Cheese might do, right? It just makes sense. But the question is there any evidence for that claim? If not, it's possible. It might be true, but there's no reason to actually believe it. If there is some evidence, then it becomes plausible. And the more evidence that we get, the more probable it becomes that the theory is true. Now, to be clear, some conspiracy theorists love evidence. For example, in 2018, the flat earther Eric Dubé published 200 proofs that Earth is not a spinning ball. Instead, it's a flat Earth. And in that book, he just had all kinds of evidence thrown at proving his theory. But not all evidence is created equal. Some evidence is stronger than others. And there's a tool for testing the strength of evidence in the realm of argument called the star test. So let me walk you through this. In the star test, it says that strong evidence should be sufficient, typical, accurate, and relevant. Let me take these one by one. First of all, evidence should be sufficient. The question to ask is there enough evidence to support the claim? If there's not, if there's only just one or two pieces of evidence for a really big claim, it often falls into the logical fallacy called hasty generalization. Hasty generalization. An example of this is back when Richard Nixon was elected for president in 1972, before the Watergate Scandal. Film critic Pauline Kael is supposed to have remarked, "How can that be? No one I know voted for Nixon." Right? Sure, in her very elite Upper East Side New York enclave, sure, right? But she'd generalized very quickly from that to say, oh, this must be what the entire nation is like. Or you sometimes hear people say, who says alcohol is bad for you? My grandfather drank a 6-pack of beer every day and he lived up to the ripe old age of 93. right? We got one point of data, one piece of evidence, and we're making a pretty big claim about health and alcohol, right? That's hasty generalization. It's insufficient evidence for the claim. Next, good evidence should be typical of the other types of evidence about that claim. And the question here is the chosen evidence representative and actually typical of the other data in the set? The fallacy here, if it's not typical, if you're picking atypical evidence, is cherry picking, right? You're just picking out the one little pieces of evidence that fit what you want it to support and ignoring the rest. An example of this is the idea that if you drop out from high school or college, you will be a massive success, right? And then you can look at and find some pretty significant successes of dropouts. People like Ben Franklin, Thomas Edison, Bill Gates, Einstein, Disney, Jobs, Zuckerberg, right? Hey, you want to be like them? Drop out of college, drop out of high school. It's going to work out great for you. What's the problem with this evidence? It's not just one person, right? Are we doing hasty generalization? Not quite. Well, are these the typical high school and college dropout? No, right? They're the most atypical dropouts that you could imagine, right? So if you're making that claim based on that evidence, you're cherry picking. You're just picking the one pieces of evidence, the few pieces of evidence that fit, ignoring the parts that don't fit. Third, good evidence is accurate. Maybe this goes without saying, right? But the question is the evidence that you're getting accurate and true? And this is becoming actually harder and harder for us in this digital age when it's easy to create fake images and there's all sorts of fake news floating around. How do we know what evidence is actually accurate? I got an example of a tweet up here that was posted when the $15 an hour minimum wage is going out. And this person was saying on Twitter, if that $15 an hour minimum wage is too much, then the $85 per hour wage is too much to pay for our senators to literally do nothing. All right, pretty powerful argument, right? Well, what's wrong with that picture? What's wrong with that evidence that we have there? Can we put it back up on the screen? Anyone tell? Say again? Those aren't senators. Yeah, those aren't American senators. Those are members of the British House of Lords in Parliament, a hereditary post where they don't get paid at all, right? And they're forced to go to these interminable meetings that don't really matter. You can kind of spot them a little bit for some of them dozing off, right? So that is inaccurate evidence supporting that claim, right? And so we should be doubtful of it. Now, I could give a whole nother talk about how do we spot good evidence, accurate evidence from bad evidence, but I'm already mindful that this is a long talk tonight. So the one thing that I'll point out, as you're looking at stuff online especially, ask the question, when you see something that makes you feel a lot of feelings, if you feel really angry or you feel really fearful when you see something online, that's the point to ask the question, is this accurate? Is this accurate? Do some extra digging when you start to feel those feelings, because there is a fallacy called the appeal to emotion, where emotions are substituting for actual facts. And that can make you jump over the good work of digging in, finding out if the evidence is actually true, is it well sourced, right? Or is this just something to rile somebody up, right? So be careful when you start to feel those feelings, especially fear and anger. All right. Finally, there is the principle, and there's the test here in the STAR test of, is it relevant? Is the evidence actually relevant to the claim that is being put forward? And there's a number of fallacies of irrelevant out there. Probably the two most common that come up when dealing with conspiracy theories are the following. First, there's one with a fancy Latin name. Are you ready? It's post hoc ergo propter hoc, right? And if you're not up on your Latin, basically, it's also called correlation is not causation, right? Just because one thing happens after the other thing doesn't mean the first thing caused the second thing, right? I'll say that again. Just because thing number one happens and then thing number two happens doesn't mean thing number two was actually caused by thing number one. For example, there is evidence that, can we get the next slide? Yeah, over 2 million Americans exposed to drinking water will die this year. It's true. That is an accurate fact, all right? However, the question is, does the water cause the deaths, right? In fact, we all drink water, right, all the time. So clearly, that would be an example of correlation not being causation. Another one of my favorite examples of these is a statistic that came out a few years back that found that husbands and wives that kissed on the way out the door in the morning, they lived 10 years longer than husbands and wives that didn't do that. I mean, that's some miraculous kissing, right? You guys better go home and start doing that. And of course, the question is, right, is it the kissing that's causing the extra lifespan, or is it something else, right? Maybe something that both explains the kissing and the lifespan. There's another factor going on there, right? So correlation is not causation. That's one thing to look out for. The second fallacy is called, another Latin one, ad hominem, which means attacking the person instead of the argument, right? And so instead of saying the argument is wrong or the evidence is wrong, we're just going to say this person is wrong. And this is a sub-variety of what we already saw before, the genetic fallacy, right? We're talking about the origin of the belief and not the belief itself. A classic version of this, a few years ago, someone paid for a big billboard attacking global warming. And it said, Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, I still believe in global warming. Do you, right? What's the relevance? What's the relevance of the fact that Ted Kaczynski, this mass murderer, believes in global warming to the fact of whether or not global warming is happening, right? That is irrelevant. That's a fallacy of irrelevance. That's ad hominem. We're attacking a person instead of the argument itself. So those two are some fallacies to look out for on that point. Now, I want to quickly go back to Chuck E. Cheese one last time. Will you come with me? And let's apply the STAR test to these claims about the Chuck E. Cheese conspiracy theory, right? It's just one of my favorite ones that came up recently. All right, so first of all, sufficiency, right? We would need to ask, are just a few pictures that are being posted online about this enough evidence that Chuck E. Cheese is actually engaged in this practice of recycling pizza slices? Or there's at least one person online that said, yeah, when I worked at Chuck E. Cheese, we did this, right? Well, is one voice enough evidence to prove that it's actually happened? Is that sufficient evidence? Second, typicality. Are these pictures of the typical way that pizza looks all throughout Chuck E. Cheese chains across the country, across the world? Or are these just a few of the worst cases where someone was super hasty as they cut the pizza or something like that? Or maybe it's just one bad pizza chain and the rest, or one location that's doing this and the rest aren't, right? Is this typical evidence? Accuracy. Are these pizza pictures that you see online actually pictures of Chuck E. Cheese pizza, right? Are you sure about that? And also, just about the claim, are you sure that these are evidence, even though it's like maybe weirdly cut, is that evidence that it's recycled pieces from other tables from earlier patrons or not, right? We need to dig further into that. And finally, in the video that you can look up tonight if you want to see the real thing, right? Shane Dawson, in the midst of his expose of Chuck E. Cheese, he has this whole section in the middle talking about violence and fights that have occurred at Chuck E. Cheese locations, as well as Chuck E. Cheese mascots, the guys wearing the big hats, coming out and being like drunk or high or something like that. And the question would be, what's the relevance, right? What's the relevance that this has happened a few times to this claim that Chuck E. Cheese is recycling the pizza? All right. Our final principle for tonight, the Occam's razor test. Occam's razor. Now, you probably have heard of Occam's razor before, but who was Occam and what is his razor? All right? So this principle is credited to William of Occam. Occam's actually the place where he lived. William was a Franciscan friar, a philosopher and theologian who lived in Occam, which is in southeast England, and he lived back in the 1300s. And he was trained in classical Christian education, trained in these arts, and he developed this razor. A razor is a logical tool for eliminating or shaving off unlikely explanations for phenomenon. So, what is Occam's razor? Here's the basic version. It states that other things being equal, simpler explanations are generally better than more complex ones. I'll say that again. All other things being equal, simpler explanations are generally better than more complex ones. All right, the famous analogy says that if you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras, right? So both the idea that we're hearing hoofbeats and what could be out there, it could be horses, it could be zebras. Both those theories fit the evidence that we have. What's the simpler explanation? Well, if we were in this room tonight, it's probably that like Mr. Gold is playing a prank on us and like putting in sound effects. That's probably even more simple than the fact that like like rodeo's going through or something like that. But still, right? In most cases, zebras are very rare. Horses are much more common. The simpler explanation, it's horses. Another example of this, right? You got a really bad headache, right? And so what's the reason for that, right? Is it cancer? Right, you go on WebMDB, right? It's like, is it cancer, right? I mean, it could be. Cancer could be the reason you have that really bad headache, right? What's the simpler explanation? You're probably dehydrated, or you're at a talk that's just going on and on and on, right? Maybe one of those things is a simpler explanation of what's going on than cancer, so it's probably not cancer. Now, a key qualification, this is not always the case. This is the simpler explanation is the true one, but it's generally the case. And why should we prefer the simpler explanation? Well, William gave a very careful argument for this. And to understand it, we actually need to get to the actual razor. He didn't necessarily say the simplest explanation is to be preferred over the complex one. He said something slightly different. Are you ready for just a little bit of medieval philosophy? Yes. All right, here we go. His actual razor was, when you're formulating a hypothesis about something, like conspiracy theories, don't multiply entities beyond necessity. Don't multiply entities beyond necessity. That is to say, the answer that requires the fewest entities, which he meant causes or assumptions, is generally the correct one. The one that has the fewest causes or assumptions is usually the correct one. You can see how our common understanding derives from that. And Occam's reason for this was that if a wise, loving God created an orderly, non-chaotic universe, he would have created it as simple and straightforward as possible with the fewest needed entities and mechanisms. So for example, if he created the force of gravity to pull objects down to Earth, he wouldn't have also created a second redundant mechanism like cute little angels that hop on every ball that you throw and just kind of stomp it back down to the Earth, right? That's extra. Those would be multiple entities, and God is a better creator than that. That was William's reason for this. And also, history and observation just shows it works, right? Just generally, this is the case, and it's been a key principle that has allowed some great breakthroughs in fields like physics and chemistry and biology, and it's used all the time by doctors to make accurate medical diagnoses. And so I want to give a more practical example, okay? No more medieval philosophy. Let's talk about leprechauns, right? And I'm not just talking about leprechauns because I went to Notre Dame, right, where the Fighting Irish and the Little Leprechaun and all that stuff. Leprechauns can be added to every theory that we talk about, right? Why were you late to work? It was leprechauns, right? Why is it raining today? Leprechauns are causing the rain, right? You can successfully add leprechauns to basically every theory. So let's say you come home tonight and you walk into the living room and you see a tragedy. Your beloved flat screen TV has been shattered and your child's just sitting on the couch looking, very guilty, right? And you say, what happened? And they say, it's a leprechaun, Dad. Leprechaun, Mom, right? Like, what? Yeah. A leprechaun took the remote and just hucked it at the screen, right? And you're like, why would a leprechaun do that? Well, the ways of leprechauns are inscrutable, right? They have their own reasons for things. Well, okay, turns out, kid doesn't know, you have a nanny cam, right? So you get the nanny cam footage, and you can definitely see the kid taking the remote, doing a little dance for TikTok or something, losing control, and it breaks the screen. And you show them the footage, right? And say, oh, Dad, Mom, the leprechauns got to the footage, right? They got magic. They did it, right? Notice that we're heading quickly into unfalsifiable territory there. But also, notice also the leprechaun theory equally explains the broken TV just as well as the kid did it, right? Both those theories equally explanatory of the facts. So which one should we prefer? Occam's razor say, let's invent fewer entities. The kid did it. Some more practical examples. You go out to the parking lot tonight, you see that your tire is flat, all right? Did a secret enemy slash your tire? Or did you just get a nail in the tire wall and that let the air out? Well, unless you know that you have a secret enemy, it's probably a nail in the tire, right? That one requires less entities, less causal explanations. Maybe you get home and you close your window and you're just about to go to sleep and there's a big flash. Was it an alien spaceship or was it lightning, right? Or maybe it was a neighbor shooting off a firework, especially around here, because you don't get much lightning, right? Aliens require the idea and assumptions that there are aliens, that there's interstellar travel, right? All these different things, and you don't have to add any type of explanations to think that it was lightning or a firework. How about this? You send a text message to one of your good friends, and they don't respond for hours, right? And it was something really important to you. What's happened, right? Did their phone run out of battery, or are they secretly holding a grudge against you? Right? Well, like that would entail that you said something offensive and that they are angry and that they're the type of person that holds grudges in this particular way, right? What's the simpler explanation? So the conspiracy connection here is that conspiracy theories often require complicated webs of assumptions and causal explanations compared to what are often the much simpler official explanations. Again, this doesn't automatically invalidate the conspiracy theories, but should drastically increase our skepticism and our need for evidence. Let me give you an example here with the 9/11 inside job theory. And this comes from another great book, American Conspiracy Theories, by political scientists Joseph Uzneski and Joseph Parent. Now, the conspiracy that 9/11 was an inside job alleges that the real cause of the World Trade Center buildings collapsing were not the airplanes that crashed in, but were carefully set explosive charges. What would that theory require to be true? First, it would require dozens of agents secretly setting charges throughout the busy World Trade Center buildings without being detected at all. Second, the charges would have to be set to blow out the building in a pre-specified location and height, which the pilots would have to hit exactly. Third, the plane's impact and subsequent burning fuel and explosion could not affect the charges at all, thereby preventing them from exploding an hour after impact. And then finally, thousands of people, including the president, the 9/11 Commission, the FBI, the CIA, the NYPD, and all the major news organizations would need to work together to hide explosives, destroy evidence, and mislead the public. Compared to the official explanation, the conspiracy is fairly complicated and requires many more assumptions and causal elements. All right, so those are 5 principles that help guide us to know which conspiracies might be true and which ones we should doubt. And again, none of them can fully disprove any conspiracy theory, but taken together, hopefully they can provide some guidance. I want to close tonight by examining one of the oldest conspiracy theories that we have on record, which is the conspiracy theory that we find in Matthew 28, saying that Jesus did not actually rise from the dead, but his disciples conspired to steal his body and promote the idea that he resurrected. And we see this again explicitly being commanded by the chief priests, telling those guards that were at the tomb to spread the story around and start this conspiracy theory. So let's apply our tests. The source test. Both the high priests and the disciples are heavily biased. So that's just something we have to acknowledge. We're not going to win on that front. One thing that is interesting is that one of the greatest attackers of the early Christians, Paul, turns into one of the greatest supporters and says that he actually saw the risen Jesus, right? That is a very big surprise, and if someone does that with a theory, it's a sign that you maybe should look further into it. Second, the time and numbers test, all right? So we have at least 12 disciples who are allegedly part of this conspiracy, plus many other witnesses. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says there's over 500 people who said they saw the risen Lord, who would all have to be part of this conspiracy. None of these people recanted, even until their deaths. That's a lot of people in a long time. The falsifiability test. Is the theory that the disciples stole the Bible, stole the body of Jesus falsifiable? It is, right? So that's a sign that maybe it's worth trusting. On the flip side, by the way, and this is fascinating to me, Christianity And the resurrection of Jesus himself is the only falsifiable religion at all, right? In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile and you are still in your sins, right? This is a extremely strange thing that someone would do, that hang the entire strength of an entire religious system on one verifiable historical fact. Right? We don't see any other examples of that happening. So Christianity itself is falsifiable. All right, the star test. In favor of the conspiracy theory, we have, for sufficiency, we have 4 guards that apparently saw this. For typicality, how typical are these people? They're kind of untypical for most people in Judea at the time period, but not radically so. For accuracy, there is a pretty big question for accuracy. I'm not sure if you've spotted this. But allegedly, these guards, they were sleeping, and the disciples crept in, moved a really heavy stone out of the way, and took the body out, right? How do they know that happened if they were sleeping, right? How do they know that, right? So that's a big question about the accuracy of their evidence here. Relevance. Is their idea and their evidence relevant? Yes, that would be relevant. Now, on the other side, again, for the disciples' claim that Jesus did actually rise from the dead, we have a lot of sufficiency. We have 6 independent historical accounts in the New Testament, the 4 Gospels, the book of Acts, and 1 Corinthians, all attesting to this as a historical event. And they're all very early historical sources, something that's, again, pretty rare in history to have that type of attestation. And again, we have over 500 people that are reporting this evidence. Now, typicality. Has the evidence been cherry-picked? Have we just picked like the best possible evidence for this? No. This does not only come from the core 12 disciples who might have been respected. Very strangely, the first people to see Jesus and say that he's risen are women. These are the most atypical source that you would ever want to pick in the ancient world, because women were considered as people who shouldn't give any testimony at all. Basically, their testimony counted for nothing in the ancient world. So these are very atypical sources of evidence at this time period. And of course, we have the atypical source of Paul, one of the early enemies, who's now saying it happened. Accuracy. Is this evidence accurate that they're saying Jesus rose from the dead? Well, that is the crux of the question, right? And so that I will leave to you to consider. But then finally, relevance. Is what they're saying relevant when they say Jesus rose from the dead? Absolutely. Finally, Occam's razor. To believe that the disciples stole the body and Jesus did not rise from the dead means that you have to believe the following extra assumptions. First, you have to believe that the disciples hatched a plot to pretend Jesus was still alive after seeing him be captured, tortured, and die a shameful death, and knowing that his promises of being the Messiah and being the Son of God had been decisively proven false. But they still wanted to go forward with this plot. Also, secondly, it requires the disciples to come out of hiding and risk the penalty for grave robbing, which would have been death in the ancient world, and roll away this very heavy stone, all while the 4 Roman guards stayed sound asleep, right? And these guards, they knew their business, right? They knew that if they fell asleep, the penalty for that would be death. So they would have had every reason to stay awake, at least one of them. Also, the guards would have to know that the disciples stole the body and then never prosecute and try to arrest and kill the disciples, which there's never any evidence that they did, right? So they just, for some reason, give them a pass on that. And then finally, the disciples would have to inspire hundreds of other people to also lie, saying they'd seen the risen Jesus, including their enemy Paul, and then go on to endure persecutions, torture, and horrific martyrdoms, all keeping the secret, and again, not a single one of them recanted. So you either have to believe all that, or you have to believe that Jesus actually rose from the dead. Today, it's becoming harder to tell conspiracy fact from conspiracy fiction, but I hope that the principles in tonight's talk can help you determine where the truth lies. But more than anything, we need to hold fast to the instructions given to us in 1 Peter 1, verse 13, where it says, "Prepare your minds for action. Be sober-minded, and set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ." Thank you. Thank you.